This is Beyond the Big Screen podcast with your host, Steve Guerra.
Today we have a bonus episode from a conversation I had with Sarah Tank Salvala of the Rejects and Revolutionaries Early American History podcast. We talked about some of the less known events of American history that had a huge impact on the later development of the United States. If you join up on Patreon, you will get more exclusive bonus contents just like this. I hope you enjoy and definitely consider subscribing so you can get all new full episodes ad-free and early. If you want to learn more, just head over to beyondthebigscreen.com. You can, of course, support Beyond the Big Screen on Patreon. By joining on Patreon, you'll get bonus features like this and much, much more. So go over to patreon.com/beyondthebigscreen to subscribe. If you ever have any questions, comments, or feedback, send me an email to my email address, steve@a2zhistorypage.com, or follow us on various social media platforms, all of which can be found in the show notes. And with this, enjoy this bonus content on early American history.
Oh yeah, in a big big way. Everyone, I mean, the thing is, at this point in American history, most people had been born in England. Not everyone. There was definitely that first generation of people who had been born in America, but they were English. They didn't call themselves American. They were English people. And so what happened with the Parliament and the King and Puritanism and Protestantism and Catholicism and all of these things, all of these forces that had been gaining steam since before anyone even successfully set up a colony in North America. I mean, those are the things that people cared about, you know? And so when the war happened, they might not have known in detail what was happening in the war, but they definitely took sides and they definitely cared.
And it's probably hard to tell exactly, but are they kind of getting the gist of what's going on? Not in real time, but kind of.
Yeah, they definitely have the gist of what's going on. And it's funny because in some cases, you can see the colonists with their sort of distance having a little bit more clarity because they're not getting pulled into the details. And so they sort of realized that things were going, that King Charles was not winning this. They seemed to realize that well before people in England had fully accepted that fact and fully believed that fact. And so in terms of like they definitely got the gist. There were ships going across the Atlantic and it took about 6 weeks. So, you know, sometimes like in winter they were getting maybe a little bit less information, and then in the more temperate times of year, they're getting a little bit more information, but they're definitely getting information for sure.
And wasn't there a really big battle of the Severn actually in England too?
Yeah, the Battle of Worcester was, it's so funny because that's actually the last major battle of the Civil Wars in England was on the Severn River in Western England. And that was when, well, depending on your political affiliation, either Charles II or Prince Charles, the future Charles II, led mostly Scottish troops down to try to take out Cromwell. And that did not go well for him. But
the transformation that England went through in this time it's incredible. And it happens so fast, and there's so many reasons. Like Spain is really running the colony show between the Americas and Europe, but the British seemed, I don't know, hungrier, you might say. Like they wanted the riches, and they were willing to go a lot further than the Spanish were. Like the Spanish kind of like, they liked the idea that they had the ATM that they could just keep cashing in of digging precious metals out of the mountains, where the English seemed more apt to try different things to get more wealthy, getting into different trades, the slave trade, the spices, like they were more willing to get their hands dirty than the Spanish seemed to be.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right, because the Spanish Empire at this point was sort of on its way down. Like Spain was sort of had some, they had some wars going on, they had some financial difficulties. And England was really starting to see itself as the potential leader of the world. And there was a lot of really weird religious thought that drove a lot of this. But yeah, they've really wanted to establish England, and they really saw this at this moment. They really saw this idea that England could be this world hub, and that had never really been. Before the 1650s, that had never really been on the table,
Now we have for number 7, I think that's the one thing that's always shocking to me. And it really hit me. I was reading just a children's book about Roanoke with my son. And it said, was it Thomas Rolfe? Was that the governor who left? Was that his name?
Oh, it was White, John White.
He leaves. And so you be generous to them that it might take 3, 4, 5 months each way as the sea. But he was still gone for like a year and a half, that he must have just been hanging out in England.
He was trying to get back, and because his family was there, I mean, he was trying to get back, and he just, with all the Spanish war stuff that was happening, they were not letting ships that could be used to fight the Spanish go, try to find some people who may or may not still be alive in America who weren't really going to do that much for the benefit of England. And he tried, and Raleigh was like, that's a lot of money. And Elizabeth was like, no, you can't, this is a national security issue. You cannot go across the Atlantic right now. And by the time all of that was done, it was 3 years later.
I mean, as far as theories go, that's probably seems, I had never heard that theory. And I think that seems like maybe more reasonable than any, because you figure after 20 years, how many of the adults are really around? Like the people who are obviously English, probably most of the kids would have assimilated into the local culture and they wouldn't have to be killed off. So, if you're talking about that, maybe they killed a couple of people who were clearly English.
Yeah.
That's not out of the realm of possibilities.
Yeah, I find it the most reasonable explanation that there is, actually. It sort of fits with all the way that things worked back then, and it fits everything. And I totally buy it, not to get biased, but totally, that's what I believe. So
Barbados is really interesting because, I mean, if I was forced to find it on a map, I probably could, but it was much more connected into the 13 American colonies than I ever thought it was.
Oh yeah, it's sort of the cornerstone of American success in a lot of ways, because New England, they got into shipping, and their shipping focused on Barbados. Maybe they hit Virginia, but the Chesapeake didn't really have that much money. Barbados had money and resources. Now, the slaves also went through Barbados. Even when the slave trade started to be a thing, there weren't slaves being shipped directly to North America at all. They went to Barbados, and then Barbados might trade them for food. They might trade them for whatever. But it was the cornerstone. And when England started wanting to become an empire, a big part of that was wanting to capitalize, people in England wanting to capitalize on Barbados's financial success, because they were extremely rich at this point.
This is a little bit beyond the time that we're talking about, but was Barbados ever in play to be like the 14th colony?
I don't think it ever could have, but it always had the Revolutionary War ideas before anyone else. And they actually issued a Declaration of Independence, even toward the end of the Civil Wars. And they were talking about things like, we don't want to be taxed if we can't have political representation. And so there was a big sort of revolutionary spirit, I would say, in Barbados. And a lot of that was where that grew up. And then it was transferred to America. But down the line, the situation was a little complicated and was a little bit different. But, who knows? It would have been interesting if it had.
And wasn't Barbados, well, you said that Barbados was vastly wealthy. That's probably one that the crown's not going to easily let slip away.
Yeah. And this gets into a little bit of stuff that I'm not fully clear on yet, because it's a bit down the line for me. But over the course of time, I think Barbados's white population had largely moved back to England. And they it was much more just populated by slaves by the time of the Revolutionary War, I think, but I'm not sure, but I think. And so the question, like, slaves weren't going to revolt in favor of independence because it didn't really. And then the people within England, I don't know. I that's something I'm not fully sure on yet. But
you see, like, these things that happen so far in the past, but they really do affect the development of these colonies. That, Maryland it didn't really have a strong identity throughout this whole, going into the Revolutionary War and even the Civil War. It's kind of like a mix of a lot of different things going on in it.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it kind of makes sense when you think about, like, I don't know. It's like, if you're growing a plant, then what you do at the very beginning of its life is going to affect how it looks later on, and how you prune a tree or whatever. Not that I'm a good gardener, but like, it's sort of a, what
the
you
metaphor
do,
works.
Yeah, exactly. What you do in those early years. And that's one reason that these earliest years of American history are so interesting. It's because it's like this undistilled, like, essence of exactly what America became in the years that it was becoming that. And that's, like, one of the best things about this time period and studying it,
This might be a good time to throw in one of your honorable mentions, the gunpowder plot connections to the early Chesapeake, because that's one where you see that there's so many connections between America's not just this place that's on the other side of the world. It really is it's being influenced and influencing things that are happening back in the mother country.
Oh man. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, even in Jamestown, I would say Jamestown is one of the big ones. But like, one of the early Jamestown governors, George Percy, one of the original settlers, early governors, he was writing to his brother who was in the Tower of London. I mean, his documents are him writing to his brother who was in the Tower of London for his supposed participation in the gunpowder plot. And, that's never been proven, which is why he wasn't, like, executed. But I mean, so you have these people who were close family members of gunpowder plotters seeking some sort of a new start in America. And so all those early Jamestown colonists, one of the most interesting things in the world to me is this sort of Catholic connection of all these people who had to get out of England, because Jamestown was founded just 2 years after the gunpowder plot. But at the same time, it's happening at this time when the gunpowder plot had really emboldened this Cecil, who became this sort of central advisor to James I. And he was there sabotaging Jamestown, seemingly. I mean, it's sort of hard to tell, but it really seems like it. And he kicked off a guy named Bartholomew Gosnold for saying things that were against the king, because, well, that wasn't okay anyway, but he had the power to do that because of his empowerment in the gunpowder plot. And it was taken seriously because he had Catholic connections and the gunpowder plot. And Gosnold was really the potential best leader that Jamestown would have ever had. And then when you start to read about early Maryland history, it's harder to it's harder to maybe prove the connections, but there are a lot of those early Maryland colonists who have the same names as gunpowder plotters or their kids, or, and so there's probably some sort of family connection because it's the same like classes, it's the same networks, it's the same religion, it's the same names. So you're sort of thinking that maybe there is this connection there, which is, I find the gunpowder plot to be one of the most interesting events in history. So clearly, yeah.
And a lot of these people, like the governors and the high status people, the people who were really going there to get rich, was the New World, the American colonies, was that their get rich quick scheme? Like, let me get rich, go back to England? Or was there a group of the higher class people and the higher status people who wanted to make America their home?
I mean, early on, there was this hope that America would be a get rich quick thing. But that clearly sort of turned out to not sort of pan out, right? And it ended up being like among the higher class people. I mean, some people might have gone over there trying for that, but I mean, a lot of it was just not having any other option. I am a Catholic and I need to go and get out of here if I can. I have gone from town to town to town to town, trying to find a job, trying to find some way of making a living. And this person over here is telling me that Virginia is maybe the way. So I guess maybe I could do that. And so a lot of the higher class people end up being people who have risen through the ranks of colonial society. And that's not 100%. You have like William Berkeley and people who were sent over to be specifically to be colonial leadership. And then you have, after the English Civil War, you have a lot of people who were transported involuntarily, and they were just sent there for being political dissidents or for being prisoners of war or for whatever, just being petty criminals that England didn't want to deal with. It was really a pre-Australia like transportation thing. And these people, and so some of those were higher class people as well. And they ended up sort of taking some sort of control when they could.
Didn't that really give a lot of the flavor to New England too, where that Congregationalist, where that each town had its own church, that they were really self-selecting for that this colony or this even like town was all this kind of people who all went to this kind of church, who all did this kind of thing.
Absolutely. And, it wasn't a very hospitable environment in New England if you were any sort of a dissident, which kind of like it makes sense because they had a lot of, these like technical liberties and these technical sort of democratic things, but they also were living in a very chaotic world. And they had to be somewhat like sympathetic to them. If they hadn't been as harsh as they were, they wouldn't have developed the same way at all. And they wouldn't have been able to keep the balance of keeping their ideology and implementing their ideology if they weren't really exclusivist. And so a lot of New Englanders ended up leaving. If they didn't like the way things were going, a lot of them ended up going to Rhode Island. A lot of them ended up in Maine, and a lot of them ended up in Virginia, actually.
In the way you're breaking it down in your podcast, how do you think that the Spanish colonies in Florida play in, and eventually even in the colonies? I mean, it won't really affect direct American history for a while, but the colony in Santa Fe is starting to set up at more or less this time.
Yeah, I mean, you can see places where those colonies are like maybe used as a base or something. Like one thing that happens is Mexico, after England takes over Jamaica, reinforcements to the Spanish sort of rebel troops come from Mexico, and they come from Mexico, and so there is that interplay, but I don't know that it was necessarily different from the rest of Spanish America because it wasn't really the heart of it, you know?
Yeah, that makes a lot because it really was Spanish Florida is really the periphery. New Mexico is really, really the periphery and not the heartland of where revolution would ultimately break out.
Exactly. Yeah.